Prior to the Vikings' British, French, and Spanish contact, millions of people had been living in this country for thousands of years. The fact that people had already been living there later proved to be rather irrelevant when Columbus brought this information of fertile land, beautiful in gold, back to British authorities. As migration started, the doctrine of discovery was created. This gave migrants exclusive right to extinguish original tribal rights to ownership by way of conquest, therefore threatening the established Eastern economy. The British Proclamation line was produced. This line prohibited colonists from settling land west of the Appalachian Mountains. This effort was ineffective. After the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence of 1776 vested the new nation with exclusive authority in Congress to regulate trade and commerce and to make treaties with Indian tribes who were sovereign at the time. By the 1820s, early efforts to keep native land off limits to migrants were becoming more and more futile. On May 28th of 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act, authorizing himself to grant lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands. This resulted in the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans among different tribes. We know this time of forced relocation from 1830 to 1850 as the Trail of Tears. Also in 1819, the Civilization Fund Act was passed by the U.S. Congress, encouraging boarding schools. These boarding schools were considered progressive. Few attended voluntarily. Most were forcibly rounded up by agents from the Department of War, who enforced federal policies. These boarding schools were not fun. With harsh conditions, most were used less for schooling purposes, but more for domestic and physical labor, working children to death. Parents of these children were often not informed of their child's death, and they would be buried in unmarked graves. Following this removal period from 1815 to 1846, 1853 to 1861 is known as the Reservation Period. During this time, the U.S. Department of War became the Office of Indian Affairs. An Indian reservation is an area of land held and governed by the federally recognized Native American tribal nation whose government is accountable to the Office of Indian Affairs, not to the state government in which it is located. Although the reservation system allowed indigenous people to govern themselves and maintain some of their cultural and social norms, they were really designated to encourage Native Americans to take on the ways of the white man and minimize conflict while the U.S. government took control. From the 1870s through the 1920s, the Allotment and assimilation era was in full force, pushing to control and alter customs and practices of Native Americans. The Dawes Act of 1887 authorized the federal government to break up tribal lands by partitioning them into individual plots. Only those Native Americans who accepted the individual allotments were allowed to become U.S. citizens. The objective of the Dawes Act was to assimilate indigenous people into mainstream U.S. society by annihilating their cultural and social traditions. As a result, over 90 million acres of tribal land were stripped from Native Americans and sold to non-natives. Indian agents played large roles in the resocialization of Native Americans into Anglo-American culture. The Office of Indian Affairs, later known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, offered food rations to tribal members who refused to abandon communal living for independent farming. The federal government, along with certain religious institutions, were also responsible for taking Indian children from their families and forcefully enrolling them into military and religious boarding schools. Such institutions were created to whiten Native Americans and supplant their culture and language with American ideals and English. Known as blood quantum or Indian blood laws, Laws were put in place to establish legally defined racial population groups. With the underlying purpose to breed out Indians, these laws were a way of documenting how Indian a person was by way of ancestral bloodline. June 1934, the Wheeler-Howard Act was U.S. federal legislation that dealt with the status of American Indians in the United States. It was the centerpiece of what has been often called the Indian New Deal. The major purpose was to reverse the traditional goal of cultural assimilation of Native Americans into mainstream society and to strengthen, encourage, and perpetuate the tribes of their historic Native American cultures in the United States. The Indian New Deal was meant to stop destructive effects of the General Allotment Act and improve living conditions of Indians by promoting tribal governments. It also prohibited any further allotment of Indian lands, except Alaska, and prohibited taking land away from the tribe without consent. Although there seemed to be efforts made in favor of Native Americans through this Indian New Deal, it wouldn't last long. From the mid-1940s to the mid-1960s, Congress passed a resolution beginning a federal policy of termination through which American Indian tribes were disbanded and their lands sold. A companion policy of relocation moves Indian off reservations and into urban areas. From 1953 to 1964, 109 tribes were terminated and federal responsibility and jurisdiction were turned over to state governments. Approximately 2.5 million acres of trust land was removed from protected status, and 12,000 Native Americans lost their tribal affiliation. During this time was the launch of the Indian Adoption Project. Through this project, Bureau of Indian Affairs and Child Welfare League of America actively sought to place American Indian and Alaska Native children in white homes to save children from reservations. At this time, this was viewed as progressive and an effort to combat racism in adoption. 25 to 35% of all American Indian and Alaska Natives were removed from their homes and relocated to a white household. Characterized by an explosion of civil rights activism, beginning in the late 1960s, the self-determination era ushered in a new wave of tribal leadership. Activists across the country used political, legal, and civil tactics to force the United States to reckon with its history of mistreatment toward Native Americans. In 1975, after much debate, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. The government could now contract with tribal governments for federal services. The act rejuvenated tribal governments by admitting, rejecting, and countering previous paternalistic policies. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, was established, a federal law that prevents the arbitrary removal of Indian children from their homes by public and private agencies. ICWA was passed by Congress in response to the alarmingly high rate of Native children being separated from their parents, extended families, and tribal communities. Designed to protect the best interests of Indian children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families, ICWA directs state courts to follow a set of standards and guidelines when an Indian child is involved in a child custody proceeding. A tribal representative represents tribes in state court where ICWA is applicable.